give a 5-minute speech. They'll say cross-ex, 6 minutes, cross-ex, me to him, then 3 minutes back to me, 5 minutes to him, and then 3 minutes to me, okay? Just so you guys can follow along. And with that said, I have 5 minutes on my timer, and I'll be starting right now. So every year, there are 2,200 deaths from alcohol abuse, according to the CDC. According to the CDC, however, there have been 0 cases of overdosage deaths from marijuana over the years it's been used, which is an interesting statistic. This shows that marijuana isn't really as deadly as some would like to say. The fear-mongering that goes from some conservatives is pretty much exaggerated, as marijuana really isn't that bad. Now, I'm not saying it shouldn't be regulated, and it does need to be, and I'll get to that in a second. Also, the legalization of marijuana seems to be pretty popular, something that's a growing trend in the country. We've already seen many states legalize it in America already. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center of September 2018, 62% of Americans right now support the legalization of marijuana. It's a growing trend, and a trend that is going to spread to Alabama. It's unavoidable, it's inevitable. And with that said, I'll get into our resolution. Our resolution for today is marijuana should be legal. Now, obviously, marijuana speaks for itself. It's the drug. Should, meaning ought to, and legal, meaning for recreational use, because I'm sure nobody really disagrees with the medicinal use of it. My weighing criteria, which is essentially the way you weigh today's argument, how you should look at it, is going to be on balance. Essentially, there are 2 scales, one for the affirmative and one for the negative, and whoever can provide the best argument for the day ultimately wins this argument, and I will let you guys decide that by the end of my speech. That being said, my first contention will be on the costs of legalization right now. We'll move on to my second contention, which is benefits of legalization, and then my third, which will pretty much be my plan. So let's get into my contention number 1. Subpoint A is going to be on incarceration. According to drugpolicy.org of September 2018, in 2017, there were 1.63 million arrested for drug violations, and 1.4 million of those were due to drug possession of marijuana alone, which is over half of it. In fact, to drug possession alone, over half of that, around 650,000, a little more actually, were due to just marijuana possession. This is interesting because just possessing a drug can get you landed in jail, which I think is kind of funny since alcohol is much more deadly, yet possessing alcohol doesn't get you thrown in jail. I'll get into that in a second. And according to ACLU.org, there's a New York law that essentially states that possession of 16 ounces of marijuana is equal to selling firearms illegally, which can land you 3 to 15 years in prison. In fact, in Alabama, you can receive up to a $60,000 fine and 1 year to life prison sentence for possessing or selling marijuana. It depends on what it was, what you were doing with it. It can be a misdemeanor or a very heavy crime. Now we'll move on to my second subpoint, which is taxpayer costs. Now, according to MIC of July 18th, 2013, this is mainly going to be an example of what costs due to the taxpayer for this. Over 750,000 were incarcerated in 2010 for marijuana use. In order to keep these people in prison for 30 years, it would cost taxpayers alone over $44 billion in taxes. To keep them in jail for 1 year, it costs them just over $15 billion in taxes. This is an interesting point because it shows that making it illegal is simply not feasible. It's not something we want to be spending money on. If somebody wants to use marijuana, the least deadly drug in history, there shouldn't be any reason for us to be spending all this money on it. We could be using this money to put back into our infrastructure or federal government in order to aid certain other places, which leads me to my second condition, which is benefits of legalization. Subpoint A is tax revenue. According to the Washington Post of January 2018, legalization and taxing could at least generate $132 billion in tax revenue over the period of 8 years. Bringing it down to the state level, and that's obviously quite a lot that we can use in infrastructure, and we definitely need money in Alabama for sure, especially Jefferson County. We'll see about $52 billion of that go to the federal government for whatever they need to use it for, and then the rest goes back into citizen work. Subpoint B is going to be in regulation. Obviously, I am for regulation. I'm saying legalize marijuana. People should use it when they're driving. We should be able to allow the FDA to regulate it, just like alcohol is regulated. I don't want to be in a car crash where somebody's under the influence of a drug, of any drug, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana. But if they want to use it, it should be their constitutional right, which is my subpoint C. If somebody wants to use it, let them use it under safe conditions as long as it's regulated and taxed. And third condition will bring me to my plan. We should simply just make an amendment on it. Introduce it to the Constitution, or call for a constitutional convention, get 3/4 approval from the states. Like alcohol, we prohibited alcohol, so we made an amendment to decriminalize decriminalize it, essentially we should do that with marijuana across the board. And with that said, I'll stand down with process.
Is everyone ready? All right, so 2 minutes on the clock, starting now. First and foremost, thank you so much for that. So in your subpoint C under the second contention, what was that tagline?
Constitutional right.
Constitutional right. So you say that if the individual decides that they want to put marijuana in their body, they should be allowed to, right?
Yes.
So using this same logic, what about heroin? What about meth?
What about alcohol? I mean, people have the right to consume alcohol. 2,200 a year die from alcohol, but 0 have died from drug overdose of marijuana. So is it fair to really keep
Okay, so that was a good spill. Now answer my question. What about meth? What about heroin?
If they want to use it, they should use it just like alcohol.
Okay, all right. So next, so does this just specifically harm the individual, or does it harm those around that individual?
Depends. That's why I said FDA regulation is important, because we obviously don't want somebody driving drunk. We obviously don't want somebody driving under the influence of marijuana, because that can lead to serious accidents. But if they want to use it in a safe environment that's regulated and taxed, they should be allowed to do that as the Constitution allows.
So as far as legalization is concerned, is it time right now in today's day and age to legalize marijuana?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. Okay, so what about the munchies? So typically, as everyone knows here, a pretty okay symptom of smoking marijuana is the munchies. So if we have marijuana legalized across all 50 states, with our obesity rates as high as they already are, would this not increase the obesity rate?
With all due respect, I think you're reaching out a little bit here. Trying to prove that obesity rates are going to be up because people are going to use marijuana. First of all, that presupposes that everybody's going to use marijuana, and therefore people are going to consume more food, which I think is highly unlikely. But you're also kind of making this weird fallacious argument where you're not really providing any sort of substance for that question.
Okay, thank you. All right, is everyone ready?
Yes.
All right, so just an overview, I now have 6 minutes on the clock. All right, starting now. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today, and thank to my opponent for presenting such a great argument. So I, as the negative, had the unfortunate job of telling a bunch of college students why they shouldn't smoke pot. So there's that. However, I do agree with my opponent's definitions and his use of the resolution, marijuana should be legalized. So as the negation today, I'm going to tell you why it shouldn't be across all 50 states. So first things first is I'm going to go over his case before getting into my off-case arguments. So in his first contention, he talks about the cost of legalization. Subpoint A is under incarceration. He says that that possessing marijuana can get you incarcerated. He said in Alabama it's from 1 to life in prison. So one way that the negative is actually arguing against this is for decriminalization instead of legalization. So a decriminalized system would just simply reduce sentences or make them little to none for a marijuana possessor. However, the government wouldn't be able to profit off of someone's addictions to marijuana and to other substances. His subpoint B under this was taxpayer costs. He says that it costs taxpayers money in order to keep these people in prison. However, we can see that through decriminalization, we can do much of the same thing. So contention 2 under this is the benefits of legalization. He says that it could bring in $100 billion in taxpayer revenue. Subpoint B under this was regulation. He says that weed should be legal and we should regulate it. So, and I'm going to kind of touch base on this later, but he also said subpoint C under his Constitution argument that we all have the right to put into whatever we want to on our bodies. However, I asked him during cross-examination, what about meth? What about heroin? Shouldn't that same logic apply here? So across the board, we should, according to my opponent's arguments, legalize all drugs. So why just stop at marijuana? And that is a dangerous thought to have. And that's why his argument isn't very valid in today's round. His third contention was on the constitutional amendment. Okay, so we're going to ratify the Constitution and we're going to legalize pot. There wasn't any good details that my opponent mentioned about how this is going to be regulated. He gives this baseless claim about regulation. What about if a state doesn't even want pot to be legal in their state? So is the federal government going to go to a state and make them legalize marijuana? How right does that seem? So let's get into my own case. So my first off-case argument is that weed isn't that great for the economy. So my opponent would have you to believe that, we'll bring in $100 billion of tax revenue. However, let's look at this. Subpoint A under this is falling prices. So according to the Washington Post from this year, prices have fallen, marijuana prices have fallen 70% in the last year in states that have legal pot. Now, while this may be good for the consumer, it's not good for the producer, for the person that is selling. So a few problems with this. So if we have this government system where we profit off of marijuana, it makes it hard to put a budget set in stone. Because as the years go by, Colorado has seen their prices go down and down and down because weed has flooded the market. So there's not a stable budgeting point there. And it's hard to keep this regulation body up that my opponent is talking about because we don't know how much funds we're going to have. And we've already seen that the government is taking in a less amount of funds. So these regulations that my opponent is talking about will be nearly impossible to keep up. Subpoint B under this is keeping up with the market. So last year, according to a study from Colorado Christian University, Colorado has spent hundreds of millions of dollars a year on hospitalizations for motor vehicle accidents due to marijuana. So this is a dangerous thing because as we've seen prices go down, we don't know if this is fiscally stable because it's just a plant. There's nothing special about it. Everyone can grow it, and so it makes it not that special of a product as everyone wants to believe. So subpoint C under this is that the black markets are thriving in a legalization of marijuana sense. So according to a 2018 investigation by the Rocky Mountain PBS, they found that legalization caused the states that legalized it, their black markets to expand, not contract. In fact, law enforcement in California and Washington say they're also fighting illegal market in part because of the states that prohibited marijuana, but also people are reselling it. So illegal marijuana sales have actually increased in these states where it's legal. So contention 2 under this is health. Subpoint A, short-term effects. We look at psychology today and they list 2 short-term effects of smoking marijuana. So THC causes disrupted motor control. That's why we have so many crashes that we see with marijuana usage. 2, they talk about how it impairs memory. So marijuana doesn't completely wipe out your memory. However, it does hinder the fact on you remembering things, like if you're studying for a test or remember something that happened to you. Subpoint B under this is the long-term effects on kids. So my opponent says, well, if somebody wants to put something into their body, then they should be able to. However, this affects other people around those who are smoking pot. So the first thing is stillbirths. Women who smoke marijuana are 2.1 times more likely to have a stillbirth. 2 under this is after birth. Marijuana-exposed children are more likely to show education gaps in school, like problem-solving skills, memory, and the ability to retain knowledge. Contention 3 under this is added bonuses. So the smell of marijuana is really bad. In fact, it lowers property values according to the Orange County Register. B, this isn't feasible in Alabama. And C, and finally, we talk about baked beagles because our pets are being negatively affected by marijuana. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Thank you.
All right, ready?
Yep.
Audience ready? Yes, all right. I'm sure you guys are having fun as much as we are. With that said, get right into cross-ex. All right, thank you for that speech. Just one quick question. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good. You know, I had a pretty good lunch today.
That's awesome.
I had a good
I don't want to waste
breakfast
too much
too,
time.
and
That's
I'm
awesome.
really
But
enjoying
anyway,
this debate.
let's move on to cross-ex. So you talked about decriminalization, not legalization. So what about alcohol?
What about it?
So would you prefer to decriminalize it instead of legalize it?
Well, I prefer for our government not to profit off of people's addictions. That's what I'm saying, and they're already profiting off of alcoholism, and we see how big of a problem alcoholism is in America. So essentially, by legalizing marijuana, they will be profiting off of this addiction.
So
of marijuana.
essentially, you don't want people to have the choice to consume soon.